LK Jha continued as the all-powerful secretary of the Prime Minister's Secretariat when Mrs. Gandhi took over as the third Prime Minister of the country after Shastri's death in 1966. He accompanied her on her foreign trips and was with her in all important meetings and deliberations with visiting dignitaries. Mrs. Gandhi did rely on LK even for some politically sensitive assignments and diplomatic responsibilities, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with important leaders of the world. However, as the disenchantment with US grew and Lyndon Johnson continued to rub the ship-to-mouth existence and the domestic politics of that time, her dependence on CPI, all that made her lean towards the left, and LK started feeling uncomfortable, and Mrs. Gandhi did not make any effort to reverse this impression because a palace coup was already cooking up. And we get a glimpse of this in IG Patel's memoirs, which are called Glimpses of India's Economic Policy. And he writes, quote, on our visit to Washington in 1966, the party from Delhi included LK, Pitambar Pant, H.M. Patel, Mrs. Gandhi's personal staff. Rajkumar or B.K. Nehru was already there as ambassador. In London, we changed planes and boarded the presidential plane sent for Mrs. Gandhi. Among those who joined us were two boys, Rajiv and Sanjay, and a somewhat mysterious figure at that time, Parmeshwar Narain Haksar. Most of us did not know him and had no idea why he was there. However, it soon became clear that he was to succeed LK, whom Mrs. Gandhi dispatched to Bombay as the governor of RBI. Haksar was a very able IFS officer, apparently an old friend and a leftist, and was closer to Mrs. Gandhi personally, if not ideologically. And good. And who was Haksar? Haksar belonged to Allahabad. He had been educated at home in Sanskrit, did his MSc from the Allahabad University. He had his degrees in political economy from the London School of Economics and was inducted into the Foreign Service by his close friend Jawaharlal Nehru in 47 and had served in our missions in Nigeria and Austria before being sent to London as the Deputy High Commissioner. But more importantly, he had known Indira Gandhi from the student days in London and in the late 1930s, even though family links predated this friendship. They had kept in touch, and in early 1967, she plucked him out of his diplomatic career and appointed him as a secretary in the Prime Minister's Secretariat. But even before that, he's credited with having given her the 10-point agenda, which was formally adopted by the Congress Party in May 1967. And these included social control over banks, nationalization of insurance, strict control over imports and exports, state trading in food grains, the spread of consumer cooperatives, control over monopolies, focus on minimum needs, urban land ceiling, as well as land reforms in rural areas, and abolition of privileges, titles, and privy purses to the former rulers. Thus, Haksar emerged as the ideological beacon and the moral compass, playing the pivotal role in the much heralded Garibi Hatao, which changed her image from a gungi gudiya to a powerful iron lady. In him, Mrs. Gandhi found a philosopher, tactician, guide, advisor, and a very efficient chief of staff. For her, Secretariat had now become a very effective machinery of governance. In turn, he raised the power and influence of the PMS to an unprecedented height. And though he himself shied away from publicity, as he believed in the principle of anonymity, yet the fact is that as far as power was concerned, as far as expanding his influence was concerned, Haksar was no saint. He ran a parallel government from the Prime Minister's Secretariat. Under him, the cabinet ministers were downgraded, the autonomy of government departments was destroyed, the cabinet secretariat became a cipher, and the concept of neutrality of civil services was seriously compromised. In fact, he was the one who gave thoughts about committed bureaucracy. But to be fair to him, he played a superb role in the coordination and crisis management during the Bangladesh War of 1971. And this was the period when PMS was the think tank, was the policy fount of the country, and the concentration of power had taken roots. And in December of 1971, Haksar was now given the title of Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister. Now, Haksar was very good in foreign policy, in defense, and strategic affairs, but there was a gap insofar as the management of economic policy is concerned. And therefore, another Kashmiri, the reticent academic PN Dhar, was drafted into the PMS in 1970. Now, Dhar had been teaching economics at the Hindu College and started looking after the entire range of economic activities, dealing with banks, dealing with the Garibi Hatao program, and other initiatives of the government. During the Shimla talks which followed, differences between Haksar and Dhar came to the fore. Dhar felt that India should have insisted on the ceasefire line being the international border, but Haksar was more ideological than grounded, and Haksar's view prevailed. This was, in fact, the last real victory of Haksar, because after that, the decline of Haksar's influence started. His detractors got the better of him. But the real reason for his decline was that he took a principled decision against Sanjay Gandhi's dream factory, the Maruti project, and his was the only voice opposing the heir apparent's, ideas about giving a people's car to the country. However, Haksar did not read the writing on the wall. He did not really gauge the influence that Sanjay Gandhi had begun to have on Mrs. Gandhi. And he kept sending her long notes and unsolicited advice. And therefore, Mrs. Gandhi thought that he's better suited for the Planning Commission. And therefore, very quietly, on the 28th February 1973, he was moved to the Planning Commission, and Dhar became the head of the Prime Minister's Secretariat. But Dhar was not called Principal Secretary. He was just called a Secretary. And many people feel that because he was not from the IAS or the IFS, he was not given the title of Principal Secretary. PN Dhar has given us a wonderful memoir, which is called Indira Gandhi, the Emergency, and Indian Democracy. And he cannot conceal his admiration for Mrs. Gandhi's handling of the Bangladesh crisis. That's one aspect. But at the same time, he also says that he was very disappointed with her at the conduct of negotiations at Shimla. And from his account, Dhar gives the impression that he had been isolated by Haksar and his group at the crucial stage of negotiations in the Shimla talks. That is one aspect of his recording of contemporary history. But even more important are his observations on emergency. As a good professor, he looks at emergency not as an occasion for moralizing or for justifying his own conduct, but in order to see what light it can throw on the prospects of democracy. Was India really a democratic society? Was it really a democratic country? And he feels that both the emergency as well as the JP movement both weakened the institutions which were essential for the governance of this country. Because both the emergency and both the total revolution of Jayaprakash reduced the respect for the rule of law. Because the emergency meant disregard for legal norms, and JP movement rationalized and glamorized defiance of all authority. It's a very important observation. And then that reminds the readers of Ambedkar's striking words in the Constituent Assembly, quote, "Constitutional morality is not a natural instinct. It has to be cultivated. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which, according to him, is essentially undemocratic." So it will take years for us to build a democratic culture. And indeed, much before the emergency was announced, the real power had passed from the PMS, that is the Prime Minister's Secretariat, to an organization which found no reference in the rules of business. And this is the Prime Minister's household, in which the shots were called by Sanjay Gandhi and LK Jha. The Prime Minister's Secretariat was in deep, though not terminal decline. And we shall continue the story in the next episode. Thank you.